remember it these. Okay, so we're getting back into our study here, and we've spent the last few weeks getting into the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So now we're going to come back to our chronological narrative in the book of Acts, following the storyline. And we've come to a point of Paul being on trial in Jerusalem. So real quick, let's get our context here, the big picture of the New Testament, just this overview of what the New Testament has in it in the New Testament era. Acts chapter 1 through 13, almost half of the book, covers about 16 years after the crucifixion. And in this time period, the gospel was presented initially to the Jews, then to the Samaritans, and then to the Gentiles, and spread and really became established. This is a church. The book of James was written in that time, and James, the brother of Jesus, kind of came to a place of leadership in the fellowship. Then the next 15 chapters, the focus shifts to the Apostle Paul in particular, and really following his movements in detail, his missionary journeys and his imprisonments. And during that time frame, all of these New Testament books were written, as best we can gather. And then after the conclusion of the last chapter of the book of Acts, the way things continued to go, all the apostles were martyred over the next 30-something years. And yet, despite that, the church continued to grow, and all of these other books were written that are included in our New Testament. Now, in our study together, we have looked at least fairly closely at all the books that I just crossed out. The Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those were kind of the previous series going into the year 2021, but we've looked at them. And so we're covering a whole lot of New Testament here. And now where we're at in our storyline is in the last part of the book of Acts. And we want to break it down a little bit more to know what to expect here. We've got about 6 chapters with Paul being on trial. And this happens in multiple appearances before multiple people, and then ends up with him being with not a verdict having been reached, but with an appeal to speak to Caesar. And so the last couple of chapters of the book of Acts involve a journey to Rome, which is a very eventful journey, pretty interesting stories there, and then ending up with him being incarcerated in Rome for what now we know to be his first incarceration, but history tells us he was actually incarcerated in Rome multiple times, but the book of Acts ends with him being there the first time. And just let's look back and kind of recapitulate Paul's story. He was born in Tarsus, excuse me, but then raised from the time he was at education age. We don't know for sure. Maybe this would have been after a bar mitzvah when he's 13. Who knows for sure? But he moved to Jerusalem, where he was trained at the feet of Gamaliel, highly respected religious leader at the time and scholar of the time. And then we know as a young man, after the crucifixion, he was involved in persecuting the Christians and had a conversion to become a Christian as he's traveling to Damascus. And so this is in about 33 AD. And then for a number of years, he moved around a bit. He had ministry time in Syria, around Damascus, ministry time in Arabia, a little bit of time spent back in Jerusalem, which to him is now sort of his hometown. He's not his childhood hometown, but it's his hometown as a young adult and beginning a professional life, you could see it as. That's Jerusalem is his town. I just kind of want us to have that sense about that. But he ends up back at his childhood hometown in Tarsus, ministering there. We don't get a lot of details in the book of Acts about the events of these times, but we do know from the beginning, back at Damascus, Syria, he stirred up controversy to the point that he had to be snuck out of the city. And so this is the way Paul's ministry has been from day one, from the get-go. It's never been a quiet, calm, get along with everybody kind of a thing. It's always been something that has stirred up opponents and passionate opponents. And of course, we see it throughout the missionary journeys as well. From there, Barnabas brought Paul to the city of Antioch, where a great revival was taking place, and the first church that had a significant population of Gentiles as part of the church. And that's where Paul settled and became part of the pastoral team at this church in Antioch, Syria. And that became his home base for all of his missionary journeys. So we find in Acts chapter 12, he and Barnabas take a trip to Jerusalem to bring an offering because of famine going on in Jerusalem. Following that, they have their first missionary journey, covers a few years, have another trip to Jerusalem after that to address the issue of circumcision and what we call the Jerusalem Council. Wasn't called that in the Bible, but then after that is the second missionary journey, where he went a lot farther, didn't really get things going in Asia, although stopped by there, but got revival going in Macedonia and in Achaia, and then goes back to Jerusalem from the tail end of that briefly. Then the third missionary journey with a revisit to all those same places, and particularly really getting a strong presence in Ephesus and the surrounding region of Asia around Ephesus. Now, the journey, he traveled kind of around these places a little, with multiple visits in these places during these years of this third missionary journey, particularly around that Aegean Sea with the Asia, Macedonia, and Achaia regions. On the way, departing from here to go back to Jerusalem again, which we see is sort of his habit. At the end of every missionary journey, he wants to stop by Jerusalem. In a lot of cases, it seems to be in connection with the Passover feast. He wants to be there for Passover. And it's sort of a check-in point also with the leadership in Jerusalem on the tail end of every missionary journey. But during the travels, during the route back, everywhere he stops, there's some interaction where he feels in his heart, I'm not coming back here again. This is our last goodbye. And people are also prophesying to him that if he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to be arrested. But he's already has a sense of that in the spirit. And it's interesting how the Lord can work at times. There are times that God shares his will in a very direct way. And we see stories through the book of Acts where people have someone come to them in a dream and tell them things. We have situations where they just sort of see or hear, but apparently, like in so many words, getting an exact word from God. We have situations where God sends a person to another person to deliver them a word from the Lord. But then there's also this thing we observe where there's just a sense in the spirit, and there's just an awareness that something's coming, and it may be more detailed sometimes and less detailed other times. But that can be sometimes how the Lord deals with us. If we walk with the Lord and we seek him on a continual basis, we can get access into an awareness of things that are going on in the spiritual realm that will also affect the natural realm and affect our lives. And sometimes we can just have a notion of things that are coming. And that's kind of what was going on with the Apostle Paul here, as near as we can tell, that he knew that he was going to be arrested. And he particularly had a sense that he's got to go to Rome. And that is expressed in his book to the Romans, his letter to the Romans. So they're traveling home, and he's got a traveling party. I say traveling home, they're traveling to Jerusalem, and he's got a traveling party with him, consisting of people like Timothy and Titus, and those that are kind of just sort of his immediate helpers as ministers. And then there are others that seem like they're more like just wanting to get involved and help out. But it's a significant size of a group of people. They come to Caesarea, they stay with friends there. And we read before, when we were on this narrative previously, we read the actual storylines of landing there on the coast and enjoying the hospitality of people there and getting a break for about a week or so to just enjoy before transitioning to this next phase. Because as we saw expressed in the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the Apostle Paul went through so much hardship and emotional and physical turmoil during those missionary journeys, and he's about to go through it again in a completely different context, incarcerated and standing trials. But he gets this little respite in the middle of a nice time, just enjoying fellowship with people of God who appreciate him. So now let's get past that and get to the hardship. So we come to Acts chapter 21, and where we left off was in the middle, and we'll start off there at verse 17. Says, and when we, why does it say we? Because the book of Acts was written by Luke, who at this point was part of Paul's traveling party. So Luke, the writer, is traveling with Paul at this time. And he says, and when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. I want you to take note, just to kind of be aware of what the situation is with the New Testament church. James is the only leader named here. It doesn't even name Peter. My guess, my speculation is that the Apostle Peter may not have been in town at this time. I would think if Peter was there, it probably would have said, went in with us unto James and Peter, and all the elders were present. But I don't know that for sure. But only thing I know is that James is the only one named here. So I just want us to take note and have an awareness that James, the brother of Jesus, is as prominent a leader in the New Testament Jerusalem church as anyone, including the Apostle Peter. A lot of us are kind of unaware of that. You know, we remember the names from the Gospels, Peter and James and John, but of course that's a different James in the Gospels than this one. A lot of people really don't understand that James, the brother of Jesus, was a very, very top level leader in the New Testament church. Okay, so all the elders were present. And so verse 19, and when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. So Paul shares testimonies about the great things that have been done on these ministries. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, okay, now I just want to pause right there. So they have a positive reaction. Okay, this is the leaders. They have no problem with the Apostle Paul. They have no problem with the Gentile ministry. They've already addressed and understand that Gentiles are part of the kingdom of God in this New Testament era. And they have no issue with what's going on. They're excited about what Paul is doing, and they glorified the Lord in reaction to the stories that Paul shared with them. Then they said unto him, thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. So this is interesting because, to me personally, actually until, I don't know how many, a few months ago, but within the past year, I have misread this story. And I always thought that the concern here was strictly with the non-believing Jews being upset with Paul. But James and the brethren are talking to Paul right now about Jews who are believers, who are converts. And they're saying, we have, as the Church of Jesus, we have a massive presence here in Jerusalem. Now, of course, Jerusalem is almost exclusively populated with Jewish practitioners. And he's saying, we've got thousands of Jews in the church here. Problem is, here in Jerusalem, just the way things are in Jerusalem, we understand this new era where God has opened things up to the Gentiles. We understand that circumcision is no longer a thing of only spiritual, not a fleshly circumcision. We understand that the practice of rituals is done away and that all of that is converted into spiritual practices. However, we also understand our constituency here and the thousands of believing Jews that are a part of our fellowship, where many of them are still zealous of the law, and it's harder for them to accept the new way that God is doing things, and the transition to where it's all about spiritual fulfillment of the law and not just ritualistic fulfillment of the law. So the advice that they have is to have the Apostle Paul join himself with 4 men, they said, who are under a vow. Presumably, this is referring to what the Bible calls a Nazirite vow, where there are certain things that you do to separate yourself for a period of time and dedicate to the Lord. And, you know, we do similar things today without the same specific guidelines from the Old Testament. But if you just sort of dedicate a day to fasting and prayer, or maybe some point in your life you have or will take 3 days out to where you just disconnect from everybody and you try to just be in prayer and study of the word, focused. Maybe you do some fasting during that time, or maybe you don't separate from everything, but maybe you have a fasting period that covers 3 days or 7 days or something like that. Any of those things would be a little time frame that we take to really dedicate to the Lord and seek after a sort of a transformation in our spiritual condition that can then affect the rest of our lives. And so this is something that was prescribed in the Old Testament law called the Nazirite vow. And they apparently had 4 men in the church who were doing a Nazirite vow together at that time. By the way, just be very, very clear on some Bible vocabulary. Nazirite vow is not connected to being from Nazareth or living in Nazareth or the location of Nazareth at all. A person who is from Nazareth is called a Nazarene, not a Nazirite. Nazirite does not mean from Nazareth. Nazarene means from Nazareth. So Nazirite vow is just a way of separating yourself. Actually, one other example of things that we do in our day and age that I didn't just mention is go to a retreat. If you've ever been to a men's retreat or a women's retreat or a prayer retreat, or some other type of spiritual context retreat where you take 3 or 4 days, maybe you travel to a location, and during those days you're mostly just focused on spiritual things. So this involves some rituals, this Nazirite vow. And they felt like, well, if you can be seen publicly participating in this, that can demonstrate to all of the onlookers that you are not an opponent of the law, but that you yourself practice the law. Because that is something to be aware of, that Paul, while preaching that you don't have to get circumcised or any of these other things. In his personal life, he continued to faithfully practice the law. That was just his habit. That was his lifestyle. That was his regimen. And he didn't discontinue that. And he didn't encourage Jews not to follow the rituals. He just preached very plainly, it's not really necessary and it's not really part of coming into the kingdom of God or being saved. But he did continue to practice it and loved it and enjoyed it. So they wanted everybody to see him doing something that was noticeably adherent to the law. And they told him to participate with these 4 men with the Nazirite vow. So he did that. And also something to kind of just understand about how all this works. The picture that I have on the screen is possibly what the temple may have looked like, and then Jerusalem, the city outside of the temple. The temple was where sacrifices were made, but also people just sort of congregated there. It was really like a community center, but a community center with the very particular purpose of the things of God. And so there were a lot of rooms around the temple, and people could gather there and maybe have discussions about Bible issues or whatever. They could gather together and have prayer. They could go individually and just find a place of prayer. And it's just a location that's dedicated to seeking God and dedicated to the things of God. And in particular, the practice of the priestly rituals of sacrifice and things like that. But people were free to come and go there. And they did come and go there. And they didn't, from what I gather, reading the Bible, they could have meetings there without necessarily clearing it with the high priest or anything like that. You just kind of go and use it. It's a community center, but exclusively for Jews. If you're not a Jew, you are very much forbidden to enter into this temple. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because at this time, you've got Jews there from all over, and you've got Paul there, and he has people that came with him from his missionary journeys that kind of joined to his traveling band from where they were, right? And some of them were Jews, but not all of them were Jews. But he did not bring them into the temple if they were not Jews, because he was respectful of the traditions. And he's not really looking to cause a controversy. As controversial as the Apostle Paul's ministry was everywhere he went, if you look carefully, he didn't go around intentionally provoking to stir up controversy. And I would really point that out to anybody today who does think that's the way they should run their ministry. That's not how the Apostle Paul did it. He didn't go to impose himself in a negative impact on situations. He just stood for what was right, and then things followed him. So he didn't bring any Gentiles into the temple, but there were some Jews who were from the Asia region, probably Ephesus, who recognized somebody with Paul as a Gentile and assumed that he had brought them into the temple, although they didn't see that specifically. And that is the supposed offense that they use to grab him while he's in there participating in these purification rituals for the Nazirite vow. They grabbed him and started screaming and yelling to get everybody's attention that he has done this stuff. Just noticed a message, not sure from how long ago, about a question. Go for it, Greg.
Sorry, I was on mute. Hey, I don't want to mess up your rhythm. It was more around the law. So why don't you we'll move it to the end of this. Just hit me back right at the end. Keep going with your thing.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so they stir up a crowd, and then we go to verse 30, it says, and all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. So this is a really quick narrative, but if we really try to follow this and absorb what's going on, I think we have to realize this turned into a huge uproar really quickly, to the point that the temple authorities shut it down. They shut the doors of the temple and like, okay, we can't have any activities going on here right now, because this is a craziness. There's chaos taking place. It's a violent mob, and so violent, verse 31 says, and they went about to kill him. Tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. And reading a verse that I'm going to leave out that of how things transpire in a minute, when it says they went about to kill him, doesn't just mean they were looking to see, okay, what could we do about killing him? They were in the process of physically beating this man, and they were in the process of killing him when the chief captain of the band became aware and was told. And so said that he immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. Oh, that's the verse I meant. I guess I did leave it in here. My bad. So they were beating Paul when the chief captain and the centurion and the soldiers came down here. Now, real quick, just for some understanding of some of this, I want to point something out here. So you've got the chief captain of the band, right? So we're talking about a Roman army military leader, and he's the guy that they went to say, man, there's a problem in Jerusalem. And so he took soldiers and centurions. Centurions are high level in this Roman army. The word centurion alludes to being a boss over a century of soldiers, which would mean 100. Apparently, I don't have a full understanding of this, but apparently in practice at the time, it wasn't always 100, may have been more like 80, but that's still a lot of people under your command, right? You're pretty solid authority if you're a centurion. Well, this chief captain, he has centurions answering to him, okay? So he is a very, very high level military officer in this Roman army. Also, this I don't know if it can be verified. I don't have a verification of this. I'm just drawing what I'm about to say from my reading of the Bible. And that is that through this time frame of what happens on this day and continuing on for several days until the point that Paul is taken out of Jerusalem, the chief captain appears to be the top authority, the top Roman authority, not just Roman military authority, but the top authority for the Roman occupation, where previously we've had governors, and we've had Pontius Pilate, who was a substitute when a king had been removed from one of the Herod family kings. And so I don't know if it's really just a political void at the moment, or maybe more likely there's a governor, but he's not in town at the time. But one way or another, what we're really looking at with this chief captain, so I'm just pointing this out because when we read this, I don't want us to see this as just a police captain who's just doing an arrest. What we're really seeing happen, this guy is the top official in the city at the time. Okay, that's who this chief captain is. So he comes in there, and then the Jews are like, oh, okay, it wasn't me, I wasn't touching him. They left off beating of Paul and let him take him. So the chief captain with his soldiers, they bind Paul and they're taking him away, but the crowd didn't really calm down. It's still a massive, violent, just uproar that's taking place, to the point that the chief captain said, you know what, we got to take him to, the Bible says the castle, the King James Bible says the castle, but this is apparently actually referring to the barracks or the military station there, right? You could think of it almost like the police station, taking him to the police station where all the soldiers live. And certainly they have some holding cells and these kinds of things there. So that's where we're taking him to, what the Bible says, the castle. But they had to actually pick him up and carry him because this crowd is so violent and so crazy. And so they're taking him up the stairs to just get away from this crowd, this mob. And Paul says, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus in the city of Cilicia, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, chief captain, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, chapter 22, men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. This kind of baffles me. I really read this and I labor to really understand a lot of what goes on in this story. So they're in an uproar, but they got completely quiet as he's speaking to them in Hebrew to hear, all right, what do you have to say? And they respect the Hebrew language. And so here we go. So he says, I am verily a man, which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city, Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. And I was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And so here we find a little thing that Paul does a lot of the time. He wants to make a connection with his audience and establish hey, we're kind of on the same page, in at least in some ways. Said, I was zealous just like you are. So he's kind of like complimenting them. Said, I understand that the passion that you're operating with comes from a zeal toward God. Said, I persecuted this Christian way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. So I was doing the same thing you're doing to me right now. I did the same thing. As also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders. Let me mention something about the high priest really quick. The high priest is now at this time in history an appointed position, appointed by the Roman authorities, instead of a birthright as a eldest son in the family, in the lineage of Aaron. And so that's where we get some weirdness going on with high priests. The high priest who he's referring to here was Caiaphas, who was the high priest presiding over Jesus's crucifixion and was the high priest in the early book of Acts. He's not the operating high priest at this point in time while this is happening in Acts 22, just so you know. And we're going to see a little bit more with that probably next week. But he said, the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and I went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. So I understand what you're doing, trying to get me punished. I did the same thing. So he then testifies about the light on the road to Damascus and how his whole conversion, the voice of God speaking to him, and then Ananias coming to him in Damascus and saying to Ananias, saying to Paul, now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. I love the significance that Paul felt while testifying to this group of people. He's going to take the opportunity to tell them about water baptism. Now, he said, listen to me, I'm making my defense, right? Making my defense about what you're accusing me of. But he felt like it was important with this opportunity to speak to these people who won't normally listen to him, to tell them about his water baptism and the name that was proclaimed over him in water baptism. In verse 17, and it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, this is talking about way back when, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance and saw Jesus saying unto me, make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. So I think Paul is talking about that early time. The Lord already told him the Jerusalem powers are not going to listen to what you have to say. And at that time, it was hard for him to accept, because he's like, I'm just like them. I understand that they oppose this, but they know that I opposed it just as much as they ever have. So maybe they will listen to me. This is what I feel Paul is going through at this time, getting this message from the Lord. He's like, no, I think I can tell them. I think they'll listen to me because I'm just like them, and they know that. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. But the Lord said unto Paul, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. So Paul is connecting his early experience to the experience of this very day, and where the Lord already told him that they're not going to listen to you, even though you were 100% one of them. They're going to do to you just like you were with them doing to others, even though you were one of them. And he shares the specific fact that all the way back then, the Lord revealed to him that I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. So here's the reaction. They got very quiet, right, to listen to this. They heard about him being a persecutor and being a faithful part of the religious establishment, the Jewish establishment. They heard about his personal conversion. They heard about his word from the Lord that told him he's got to get out of Jerusalem. And he's also, I think, part of the reason he's sharing that is to say, I really didn't, it wasn't me that even wanted to leave here. I wanted to stay here and be a part of what's going on here the whole time. But God sent me away, and God told me he was sending me to the Gentiles. So now this quiet crowd erupts. Said they gave him audience unto this word. Unto what word? The word Gentiles. As soon as they heard that word, they didn't give audience anymore. Said they lifted up their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. A person like this, who would claim that God has sent him to the Gentiles, is not even fitting for him to breathe oxygen, and we need to kill this guy. That is so extreme to me, you guys. And this is where I'm saying, like, I read this story and I want to understand, and I can't really understand this, you know, where these people are coming from and how extreme they are with the things that they believe in and the way they believe in them. They're ready to kill this guy just because he said that. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air, I mean, this is extreme. They're acting just nuts. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle. I will say this about the casting off clothes and throwing dust into the air. Some of these things are cultural expressions of a reaction to hearing blasphemy. And it's a cultural thing of what you do to demonstrate, I have no approval of what I just heard. That was blasphemy, and here's how I express my judgment that that thing that was spoken was blasphemous. Verse 24, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, which is beating with a whip, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs or leather strips, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, I just love Paul right here. So he's being brought to be beaten, right? And actually we see he was actually brought all the way to where this is going to happen, to the guy whose job it is. He's a specialist. He's a scourger. And Paul just says, hey, is this legal for you to do this to a man that is a Roman and hasn't faced a trial and been ruled guilty? Can you really do this? And so when the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. In other words, if he's not a Roman citizen, they can do whatever they feel like. And let me add a little clarity to what's even going on here. So first, the chief captain wanted to find out, well, what is the deal with this guy? Why is everybody upset? And so he tried to have interaction out there to find that out. But the behavior is so out of control that he can't learn any useful information. So he said, all right, forget it. I'll bring him inside. We'll have somebody beat him to tell us what's going on. And then he's like, oh, okay, I can't do that. So says then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined. Okay, the soldiers and Paul that had Paul and the chief captain departed from the scourger, him which should have examined Paul. They left him and said the chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. It's like, okay, I fortunately didn't get him beat, but I did bind him, and I'm really not even supposed to do that without a definite knowledge of an offense. So I think we will shut it down right here. There was a little bit more story that I was going to go into, but it's really, really close to 12 o'clock and I don't want to go over. So we'll pause it right there for today. Greg, what you got?
Hey, so check me on my understanding here. So when we talk, oftentimes when people talk about the law, they talk about the law as this Old Testament construct that the Jews lived, and obviously Jesus fulfilled the law and we're no longer under the law, etc. My understanding is not really quite that.
Mm-hmm.
That there are three aspects or categories, if you will, of the
Types
law.
of laws.
There's the moral
Mm-hmm.
aspect, the civic aspect, and the ceremonial aspect.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of my understanding that we're still expected to fulfill the moral and civic aspects of the law, but the ceremonial aspects are those parts that, where we look to Jesus versus the high priest and the temple and the sacrifices, etc. So,
Right.
In that sense, you would still expect fulfillment of the moral and civic aspects of the law, just not the ceremonial.
So, yeah. So I agree absolutely with the concept that you're talking about there. So the things that I'm referring to are specifically the ceremonial, the rituals, and just exactly like you said, Jesus himself personally fulfilled so many of those things, but then we also continue to fulfill them, but in a spiritual counterpart to what the physical operation would have been. Like, just for a random example, they had dietary laws, right? Those would fall under that category of ritualistic, but we understand that it's not our body, it's our spirit. So we need to be careful about what we bring into our spirit, the same way he gave them guidelines for what to take in and not to take into the body. So that's a spiritual application. Now, I would just say that all of the straight up moral laws are an expression of God's character,
Mhm.
and God doesn't change, and those things don't change. And
Right.
some of the things that fall under the label that you called the civic could kind of lean one way or the other. And so like there's even actually a couple of building codes in the Old Testament, like on your roof, you got to make sure you can't have a roof with no railing, because if somebody falls off, then that's on you.
Mhm.
But that's not, we don't necessarily have to do that, you know,
Yeah, fair
so
enough.
yeah, so some of those things, it kind of depends on, is it leaning more towards a moral expression, or is it leaning more towards, a lot of those things also were applications specific to the time and circumstance. Morals are not. Morals are above and beyond time and circumstance. But then there were some Old Testament guidelines that were very specific to time and circumstance that aren't relevant today.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So yeah, exactly what you said.